different aspects that could be considered in a farm transfer, particularly when you're looking at transferring a business, um, an existing business. And so this here, it's not the clearest slide. I've got to make a new slide at some point, but this is what we call our bubble diagram. This is of different elements of a farm transfer plan that we're often trying to address. We're often starting first with goal setting and working on family communications about the goals and about working through the process together. There may be a need for a new business plan for the future. We always talk about retirement as an element of this, even if some people will tell us that they're not ever planning on retirement, which is very common. And then we'll talk about estate planning, and not just for the older generation, but making sure that the younger generation is also providing for their estate plan. If you're talking about transferring a business, one of the things that often gets missed is people jump right to the asset transfer, whether it's the business assets or the real estate, and not think about the transfer of management responsibilities and management skills. So we try to work with people on all of these things and encourage people as they work through it themselves to be trying to address all of these things. And of course, we're going to, in the next 4 weeks, we're going to break these things down into more detail. And I'll just mention in the series, so next week I'll be spending about a half an hour on retirement planning and a little bit on long-term healthcare planning. And then we'll have Nick Bullock, who is an accountant with Farm Credit East, who's going to talk about tax planning and the transfer. The following week, we have Allison Poirier, who's a Connecticut attorney who has worked with a number of farm transfers, who's going to be speaking on the legal aspects of farm transfers, the estate planning aspects, using business entities as a mechanism for transferring existing business assets to the next generation, and some on long-term healthcare again, and planning around that. And then the last session will be around around a panel of farmers that are going through or have gone through the farm transfer and succession process, so we can hear from their stories. And I always really encourage, if people can only get to one of these live, to really make sure you get to that one. It's a great opportunity to also try to have some interaction with those of you in the audience and the farmers out there, because I think some of you are going to see that the stories are very, very similar. Some transfers are pretty straightforward and pretty simple. People can often take care of themselves with attorneys, but particularly when there's a business involved, when there's multiple children involved, or other family members who may have a stake or in the farm, they can be complicated. And each farm transfer is different, and each family is different, and they have different needs, and the timeline can be different. We had people that need to rush through it. That's the worst case scenario. One of the most challenging ones I worked on was a family where the father had terminal cancer and basically had 3 months left, and the son had left the business a while ago, was coming back, and now we had to catch the son up and the daughter-in-law tremendously in 3 months to be able to figure out how business was actually going to continue. And that's the worst case scenario that we hope to always avoid. But often, as we even saw in the poll, the timeline is more glacial. It takes a long time to work through these processes. And part of it, I always say, people, if you've got a commercial farm, you're always going to find something to do out in the barn. There's always going to be something to do in the greenhouse or out in the fields. And this is often something that gets put aside. And so that is, a big part of what slows things down. It can sometimes be difficult to define when it's complete, particularly since there may be different aspects that are going to be transferred over different time periods. One farm transfer that I worked on, it was basically a 14-year process. It wasn't that they were even having extreme challenges, but it was just that they were having a farm employee who hadn't even thought about becoming an owner, transition into more of a management role over a number of years, made sure that he wanted to commit to becoming a partner, a part owner, and then there was a buy-in to a partnership, and then they worked together as partners for many years. And then the last piece that we worked on together was on the transfer of the remaining shares of the older owners to the younger owner, and for the younger owner to buy them out of the real estate. And in other cases, the assets of the farm business may transfer completely early on, but the real estate may not transfer until death through the estate plan. So I tell people to think of it more as a process rather than any single event. Though obviously, when all assets have transferred and all aspects of the business have transferred, you could, realistically call it complete. Because this is so complicated sometimes, it can take so much time. This workshop, even the whole series, is only going to scratch the surface. And so the most important thing that we tell people is to take action. There's been surveys done over the years, not just by us, but other organizations that will look a year out and say to people, that workshop that you attended last year, was it useful? And people will say yes. And then they say, have you done anything? And a large portion of the population will say, we didn't do anything. We got a lot out of the workshop, but we didn't actually progress. And so what I encourage you is, after each workshop, and then certainly after the series is open, start thinking about some concrete steps that you can take. They don't have to be large. Just start taking some steps so you can start to gain some momentum. One other thing I wanted to mention about this bubble diagram that I forgot is that the reason we have this structured the way it's not a flow chart is because there isn't a linear order to these things. A lot of these things will interact and inform each other. It is really common for us to particularly be talking with accountants and lawyers and say, well, if you do this, this will be the implication, and so forth. And we'll go back and forth about how we're going to address these things, taking into context both legal and tax issues. And we'll be going back to the lender and say, well, we're not comfortable with this. And and then there's different family discussions that'll come in and transpire over time. And so there isn't a linear process. These things will feed off of each other. They'll interact with each other. You will find yourself going back to revisit different decisions that you had at one point when some new information or some new event happens. So we as an organization have done a lot of work towards trying to put together various resources besides this webinar series to help farmers with this process. And our website, fortunately, looks nicer than this these days, but this is an old screenshot. If you go to the Land for Goods website, if you haven't already, we have different resource pages for different aspects of what we work on, because we also work on farmland access for farm seekers, and we work with non-farming landowners on making their land available to farmers, and we do a lot of work around leasing. But we have a specific resource page for farmers on farm transfer and succession planning. And I'll just call out a few of our resources right off that you'll want to consider looking at. One is our workbook called the Farm Succession Planning Where Do I Start Guide, which has a lot of has some information, but also has a bunch of worksheets in there for you to work through to try to help you kind of get started and to think through your goals, think through what you need to gather for information and so forth. We also have, and that guide could be used by the whole family, but is particularly more oriented towards the senior generation. The next one I want to point out is the Farm Succession and Transfer Strategies for the Junior Generation Guide. So that one was specifically written with oriented towards the junior generation and to help them think through the process and what resources they need. And then the last one I want to particularly call out is our guide for successful farm transfer planning for farmers without identified successors, which is a big portion of the group here today. It's really a common scenario that we're working with, that there are farmers that do not have identified successors and are trying to think about how do I get at least the real estate, if not the farm business, to the next generation. And then there's the people resources. And we say that everybody needs a team. This is a list of the type of people that are usually involved. Often we might have all of these people involved. So there are farm transfer advisors, like those of us at Land for Good, and I'll speak a little bit more to that in a little bit. And then there are other business advisors, because if we're talking again about transferring a farm business, there's often a need to reevaluate the business as it is and how it will be run by the next generation and the financial implications of that, which I'll go into more details in a little while. There's usually going to be multiple attorneys involved. And that is because one attorney cannot represent everybody that's involved. If there's multiple generations involved, it's a conflict of interest. Now, some attorneys will sit down with everyone to have a discussion as a group, but they'll be clear that they represent, when it comes to drafting documents and providing legal advice, that they have one person or couple designated as their clients, and then they will expect that especially when we're putting together limited liability companies, LLCs, and operating agreements, or revising operating agreements, because the old one was just a boilerplate agreement, that they are going to want it's often the older generation will start with one attorney, and then the younger generation will be encouraged, if not required by some attorneys, to have another attorney review the documents on their behalf. Sometimes there's a difference too in the attorneys in terms of some are good with estate planning, not so good on the business entity aspect of it, or on real estate transfer. So they may do the first two. They may do the business entities, they may do the estate planning, but they don't want to get involved with real estate transfers or conservation easements. And so you may need to have multiple attorneys involved just on that account alone. There's tax implications that come up all the time. There are tax questions that even experienced farm transfer advisors like myself would not feel comfortable answering without an accountant chiming in. So if someone doesn't have an accountant, we're usually trying to get an accountant involved. If there are existing loans, or there are going to be new loans involved, then there's often a lender at the table, including the lenders will want to vet the next generation. If they're going to be added to the loans, they're going to want to vet the new business plan. They often will almost always will want to review the operating agreements if you're putting together an LLC. Insurance agents will come in sometimes, and not just on the farm insurance, but particularly on life insurance. Sometimes life insurance is used as a tool, as a part of covering the cost of a transfer, or if you want to make sure that if someone passes away, that their equity can be covered by life insurance. Appraisers can come in, often just for the estate appraisal at the end, but sometimes we're having an appraisal for a conservation easement, or appraisal as a part of a sale of the real estate. And then sometimes we'll bring in appraisers if we're trying to value the business, particularly the business assets, and sometimes that may be an actual appraiser in that case, or it may be farm credit appraises livestock and equipment, or auction. We bring in auctioneers sometimes because they will appraise livestock and equipment as well. So it depends on what the needs are in this particular transfer. Because communications can be complicated, um, besides transfer advisors like myself, we may bring in other facilitators and counselors to help with family communications and family stress around the transfer or otherwise. Um, and then as far as some direct transfer advising support, our organization, Land for Good, works in all six of the New England states, and we will provide one-on-one short consultations of 2 to 3 hours with no obligation to anyone to continue with us. And so that's the first option, and you can go to our website and you can sign up for those 2 to 3 hour consultations. I'm going to explain more about how in Vermont, we work with the Vermont Farm and Forest Viability Program on long-term assistance. As I mentioned, I've worked with a farm up to 14 years through funding with that program. We also currently, I should put this in here, we currently have a USDA SARE grant that allows us in all six of the New England states to provide much more extensive services to to farmers who are looking for that more comprehensive assistance. But if people start with the short consultation, we can see if it makes sense to continue for the long term. Um, Around the country, there are other nonprofits, and I'll also mention in a moment more about the nonprofits that also work through the Farm Viability Program here in Vermont. But in New York State, for instance, and in several states now, American Farmland Trust has farm succession and transfer advisors. And then there's other organizations similar to Land for Good in other parts of the country. Um, and so if you have other farmer friends in those other parts of the country who aren't here, let them know there are people out there to help them. That often includes extension, um, different university extension across the country often have people that are designated to work on succession. That includes the University of Vermont Succession. Farm Credit has their own succession advisors that work with them primarily with their clients. And then agricultural mediation. There is an agricultural mediation program, and I believe every state in the country now. The ag mediation is a free program that is funded by USDA to work with farmers on challenging communications and on conflict. So not just farm transfer and succession, but neighbor to neighbor conflict, landlord tenant conflict, issues with creditors, including USDA itself. And it offers a lot of assistance in these areas of dispute resolution and conflict resolution, but then also family communication. And they have a specific mandate to specifically work on farm transfer and succession. And so sometimes in some places they are kind of the first point of contact for people trying to help farm families figure out how they want to work together on doing transfer and succession work. And then they'll sometimes bring other of us providers in. And then sometimes it works the other way, where we're working with a farm family where it's pretty clear that communications is really what's an impediment to things moving forward. And we'll suggest that they bring in agricultural mediation so that we've got another person at the table to just help us work through the communication issues. In Vermont specifically, we also have a program called Farm First, which is available for stress and mental health issues and provides free counseling services. And sometimes when the challenges are more than just simply communication, but do go into those areas of mental health, we bring them in as well, so we can help have these other parties help us move forward with the transfer. Other farmers, as I mentioned, we have a panel at the end. We've also organized different discussion groups, and in Massachusetts, let's see, Massachusetts and Maine, is that where we're doing it, Sylvia, this year? The Farm Succession School?
Yes.
Yeah, so Massachusetts and Maine, there's still an opportunity to sign up for Farm Succession School, which is a small cohort of people that will meet 3 times and talk through farm succession issues together, along with service providers from our organization and other organizations that work through on the technical side of things. But other farmers that have, say, dairy farmer discussion groups or pasture discussion groups will sometimes make farm succession and transfer a part of their discussion. But just talking to your neighbors, many of you will know who's already been going through it or has gone through it, and just getting advice and opinions from them is incredibly useful, including, they're often a good source of referrals for attorneys and accountants. We try to do our best there as well, but we don't know everybody that's out there. And so, finding out from your neighbor, this attorney worked well for me or didn't work well for me. And the same with the accountant can be useful. So we really encourage people to talk to your fellow farmers. I've already mentioned the Vermont Farm Viability Program, which I'm going to go into a little more extensively, but I forgot to mention that Massachusetts also has a farm viability program that has been expanding their farm transfer and succession support work. And we do work, our organization does work through the Mass Farm Viability Program. So Vermont Farm Viability Program, which is one of our sponsors here, I want to just take a few minutes to talk more specifically about that program. That program is funded by the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, which many of you may be familiar with, is the quasi-state organization that funds the conservation easements when land is protected, and also affordable housing in the state. But this is a separate office, and I keep forgetting to call it the Farm and Forest Viability Program, because we also do work with forest-based businesses now as well. And the core of the program is a 2-year program, but as I've mentioned already a few times, we have money to work with families for farm businesses beyond that initial 2-year enrollment. But the idea in the first 2 years is going to be the most intensive work, particularly the first year. And the program, Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, contracts with 5 organizations that actually do the work. So Land for Good is a contractor to the Farm Viability Program, as is the University of Vermont Extension, who I also do some work for. NOFA, the Organic Farming Association, the Intervale Center out of Burlington, Vermont, and the Center for Agricultural Economy out of Hardwick, Vermont. We're all contractors to actually implement the program, to perform the work, which is to work intensively with farmers on 3 areas: business plans, cash flow and enterprise analysis, and farm transfer and succession. Each of us also has a small pool of TA money, technical assistance money, that we can use to help offset the cost of, say, an attorney or accountant. It's not a lot, especially when you get into attorney bills, but it's something that gets you going. And then we also, as money is available, we offer implementation grants. So people who've completed at least 1 year of the program with a farm transfer and succession plan, they are eligible to apply for an implementation grant, which could be used towards, say, more work with an attorney or more work with an accountant. Or one of the things I've also used the technical assistance funds for a number of times on farm transfer and succession is getting a real estate appraisal or paying for part of a conservation appraisal, the farmer's portion of if you're considering selling your development rights. And as I'm about to move on, do we have any questions in the chat? Sylvie?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Well, don't hesitate, put questions in the chat, and then I'll offer some opportunities again later on for you guys to open up your mics and ask questions. So getting started can be one of the biggest challenges. So the fact that you're here today is a great first step. Really appreciate that you're here. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the big problems for people is to to actually take some action and move on. And I describe this to people, it's like eating an elephant. I'm sure most of you have heard this cliche before, but how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And a lot of people sit there and they'll look at all those bubbles I put up earlier, and they'll get overwhelmed because they don't know where to start, or they're afraid of starting in the wrong place, or it's just so daunting and overwhelming. And as I said, it's very easy for a farmer to say, there's something to be done out in the barn, there's something to be done out in the field. This can wait. Um, and we really encourage people to think about an exit plan for your farm at any stage and not just at the retirement or the transfer phase, because there's various things that can come up. And so if you come up along the way, health issues, unfortunate deaths, changes in financial circumstances, divorces, and so forth. And so knowing what you would do in those cases is would be a good foundation towards thinking about the longer term big picture when you're working in a positive direction towards succession and transfer. But when it comes to succession and transfer specifically, what I tell people is just start with just one piece to go forward. And this is often the advantage of bringing in someone like myself or other people that are working on this, working with farmers on farm transfer and succession, because we can help people figure out what part of the elephant to start on and make sure you don't choke on trying to take down too much at once. So I just encourage people to don't get overwhelmed, just take a bite. Optimally, if you're thinking about this specifically about you're going to retire or that you just want to have the business transferred, figure it out, by a certain point, at a certain age, you want to be thinking about this at least 5 to 10 years ahead of time, because as I said, this stuff often takes time, especially when you're farming. And even if you do make a focused effort on it, there will always be something that you're going to have to attend to in the barn, and you're going to have to attend in the field, and that sometimes just thwarts the progress, or things happen like turns out the successor that you thought was going to take over the business doesn't want it or isn't capable of doing it or is reconsidered, and now you're back to looking at somebody else coming in to take over the business. So it's important to be working on it, as soon as you can. And it's important to not wait for a crisis. I already mentioned one example, but we've been brought in after people have had strokes and heart attacks, and that's what's really driving them to work on this. So that's not really the circumstances you really want to be working under, especially if it feels like there's a time crunch and it's adding stress to the discussion. You want to do it when you're, still healthy and still, in a good position to take some time to work on this. One of the other things I tell people is to make sure that you keep this on the agenda and that you specifically make time for this. It's so often it's just that people, if they don't designate that we're going to sit down as a family, as a business on the first Friday of the month, or something else that makes it tangible and specific, this is when we're going to work on this. It just doesn't happen. You really have to make sure, especially if you already have farm business meetings, team meetings, that this actually ends up on a formal agenda, that you're actually talking about it, or else it just will never happen. And when you start this, it can just be a simple conversation. If you have identified successors and they may not be family, I'll give a couple examples of where employees have become the successors in the business. Just starting with some simple conversations to get the ball rolling is helpful. Of course, if you've got children, and whether they're on the farm or not, just having some simple discussions with them about that you're starting to think about this, and you might want their input, and especially if they already are on the farm, you're going to need their input. And then you want to start thinking about assembling advisors. Who do who do you already have in your court? I've worked with people before and said, well, we've used this attorney a couple of times for some real estate transactions, but we don't think this person's up to the task. You may sign up for the Farm Viability Program, or in Vermont, or reach out to us at Land for Good, and we can start to work with you as an advisor and start to help you assemble other advisors. So when we start working through farm succession and transfer issues, particularly when a farm business is involved, one of the things that intersects often is whether the aspects of family businesses, that some aspects are the family aspects and some aspects are more of the business aspects. And every family business has this to one extent or another. And the driver, some aspect of this may be more of the driver than others, and it may vary from different members of the family. And so we look to see, well, what's really driving this. So some people, the most important thing is that the farm, no matter what, stays in the family, even if nobody is farming it anymore, or that every family member gets a chance to be a part of the business, even if they maybe aren't as fully committed. It's not a part of their skill set. Maybe they're just there because they're expected to be there. And then other times I've worked with a number of farms where it's really their focus is this is the business, and you're only going to be involved in the business as if you're actually contributing to the business, if you're developing skills and providing competency. And it's not a guarantee that everybody is going to be in the business. And the biggest concern going forward is either that the business goes forward, even if it doesn't stay in the family, or that the real estate may transfer to a farmer, even if the farmer is not anybody in the family. And there can be a lot of tensions if people are coming at this from different members of the family are coming at this from different perspectives. And if they're not talking about how do we find that right balance, so that the not only can the farm stay stay in business, but we have the best chance of the family staying in the business if that's the desire of the family. And that everybody is still going to be able to sit together over the holidays and still talk to each other and get along and feel good about how decisions were made, even if they weren't the decisions that they wanted to make. And then we often look at these farm transfers from the perspective of hard issues, as in like hardware in a computer, and soft issues, as in like software in a computer. And the hard issues are the kind of tangible, sometimes physical aspects of the business financial condition and its structure and the infrastructure, the legal aspects, tax, estate planning. Is there money for retirement, and how is people approaching a retirement? What's the mechanism there? And then how is it structured in terms of management control? Where the soft issues are more around family communications, vision. Is there an unclear vision, or some differing visions, personal goals for the business? Are people in sync with that? Or are people unclear even about what they want? Fair versus equal is going to come up throughout this series. It comes up a lot if you have if you have multiple children and somebody stayed in the business and somebody hasn't, and trying to figure out how to address non-farming heirs. And in the past, a lot of farms would just say, well, in my state plan, it doesn't matter that one person is working on the farm. I'm just going to leave the farm to everybody equally. Well, that usually turns out poorly in the end. And we're usually trying to get people to think not about what's equal, but what's equitable and what's fair, and including recognizing when farmers stay when people stay on the farm, they're often giving up income, giving up their time in a way that the non-farming heirs may not be giving up, and that the unrecognized unpaid compensation needs to maybe be considered as well. But also, just what is your goal for the farm? Um, Management abilities and just where people are at, what they're capable of growing into, um, and are willing to grow into versus just staying with what they've always done. Um, and then for the older generation, there's often a strong sense of identity around being a farmer that can be difficult, and about having managed the farm and having full control over it. And so being able to share control, um, maybe considering retiring and not having that identity anymore as a farmer can be a real emotional challenge. And it sometimes appears in the process and in the discussions, and sometimes appears afterwards where, they've stepped aside and maybe, didn't think it would hit them as hard as it um, as it did, once they had actually made the transfer. But on the positive end is the legacy. For a lot of people working through this process is about thinking about, what do I want my legacy to be, and the legacy for the farm. And one of the worksheets that we have in the Where Do I Start guide is actually a letter that we encourage people to write about what you want your legacy to be for the farm. Sometimes these soft issues are actually the hard issues or the difficult issues to work through. Sometimes we can work through all these issues on the left, working with the lawyers and the accountants and their lenders and so forth, and we can figure it out. And sometimes it's these issues on the right that really make things difficult for people to make progress. And that's part of what can add to the time, is trying to work through those things in a way that everybody can feel good about. So part of starting is figuring out about what your goals are. And if you've got a successor, or even if it's just non-farming family members that may be the ones inheriting the real estate, if you're not going to continue the business, do they have goals for the farm as well? But particularly when you have a business, each generation needs to be able to share their goals freely with each other. And one of the difficulties that we find and we see is when family members don't have that same vision for the future, don't have that same goals. And, what's really common is that the younger generation may want to change the business dramatically. They may want to do a entirely different type of farming, and that can be very difficult for the older generation to accept. And so that is where people need to be able to talk through that and think about what the big picture goal is, and how can of continuing the farm often, and how does that work for each generation. And that's where, again, people, whether it's ag mediation or people like myself, can come in to maybe help people talk through those different visions and goals. It is good to get the other non-farming family members involved, at least to make sure that they're aware of these discussions. But if there's already a family member that is a part of the business, it's really going to be the people that are running and stewarding that needs to have priority in the decision making. One of the first farm transfers I worked with was a farmer who he was in his 30s at that time, almost 40, had 10 years prior bought the dairy cattle and equipment from his parents, had converted to organic, and had been very successful for him. But when I met him at a pasture walk where I was introducing the program, and he said, I've had the cattle and equipment for 10 years now, but I have not poured an ounce of concrete on this farm, even though I need a new bunker silo, a new manure lagoon, a new heifer barn, because my parents don't have wills, and I don't own any of the real estate. And he had 6 siblings, one of whom worked on the farm, and the other 5 did not. And so he was justifiably concerned about what happens if his parents, well, especially if they don't have a will, then it would be up to the probate court of the state of Vermont to decide how this was going to be, the real estate was going to be dealt with. Um, and so when I sat down with the parents, they said, we talked about it for a while. And I said, you may not be able to satisfy everybody because that was their big holdup on getting a will done, was about satisfying all of their seven children. And I said to them, I said, well, you may not be able to completely satisfy everybody. And the mother put her hand on mine and said, but I want to. And what we ended up doing was they wanted to have a family meeting with all seven siblings and their spouses. I said, I'm not taking that one on by myself. And so we brought in ag mediation. They actually brought in two mediators and they went through a number of mediation sessions and they heard from all their children, and some of their children had more expectations for what they would get than would be practical for the farm to continue. And they ultimately came to the conclusion that they could be somewhat accommodating, but the priority was for the farm to continue with the son who was farming, who actually employed one of his brothers as well. And that meant that not everybody was going to be satisfied. And they were going to be not making an estate plan where everything was going to be equal. Um, So, the communication, as I've already said a number of times, can be challenging. And one of the things I want to emphasize, besides just getting a meeting on the agenda for the purposes of making sure it happens, is also to make sure that people are in the right state of mind. I've had more than one farmer relate to me a story where, like, dad walked up to him in the barn and said, "Do you want this farm or not?" And it completely caught off guard. They're in the middle of the workday, in the middle of working, no preparation. Well, that conversation didn't go well. Or on the other side, I've heard a couple of stories where it's just like, are you going to they walk up to them in the middle of the day and say, look, is this farm going to ever get transferred to me or not? I need to know. And it just immediately starts a conflict. It's better if people come in prepared, knowing what they're going to talk about, knowing that this hour or 2 hours is what we're going to talk about, who's there, who's going to be there. Is it a timing where people are not going to feel pressured to be somewhere else because it's so close to when you've got to make a delivery, or you got to go to a farmer's market, or you got to do evening milking, or you got crops to get in. But just timing is going to be important. Sometimes location is important. I did a workshop a number of years ago for service providers, on-farm transfer training out in Wisconsin. And one of the presenters was from Iowa. One of the presenters was from Nebraska. And for both of them, they don't hold the meetings at the family farm because if you sit around the kitchen table, what will often happen is dad will sit where dad's always sat, mom will sit where mom has always sat, and the children will sit in the same seats that they've sat in since they were in high chairs. And their point is that this is going to be a business meeting where we're talking about changing the dynamic, where it's not where we're talking about particularly the younger generation taking on different roles, sitting around the table where they're all sitting in the same roles that they've always had since childhood isn't going to help you change the dynamic. Now, for the most part here in New England, most of us haven't chosen to take that approach most of the time, but I have called it out in meetings where I feel like the dynamic is stuck and we're not making any progress. And I'll point out every meeting we've been at, we've all sat in the same places. Can I ask you, is this where you've all sat your entire lives? And I'll tell them that story and I'll say, how do we get this dynamic broken up? Do we need to meet somewhere else? Sometimes it's if there's any kind of family conflict, deciding on which house to meet at is also important. And sometimes it's why people will tell us we'd rather meet at the Farm Service Agency office or at we've used the farm credit offices, we've used extension offices, and say we'd rather meet in a space that feels more neutral, or where there's going to be less distractions. Because besides getting people to turn off their cell phones, many times I've been at farm meetings where employees are coming in and asking questions, and we're interrupted so much by the business of the farm when we're supposed to be focused in on this that we're not going to make progress. And I think about, well, what if I wasn't even there? How much more would they have gotten distracted? And that's where sometimes, again, be a broken record here, bringing in outside facilitators and advisors can help with these meetings and help with the dynamic where some people maybe are super quiet, are never going to speak up. Other people are going to dominate the conversations, where people are maybe going to get tense over conversations, and where it may make sense to even bring in ag mediation or farm first. Some of the real common concerns that we come across a lot and that we have to work through is the financial viability. Is the current business, not only is the current business profitable now, is it profitable going forward? Are there things on the horizon that may reduce profitability? And is there, even if it's profitable now, is there going to be a need for a change for that next generation? Because one of the big changes that come about that people don't think about is a lot of times in the older generation, they may be reducing their debt significantly. They've built up a lot of equity over time. If the younger generation is going to be expected to buy out the older generation, then the farm is going to have to carry more debt. And that may completely change the profitability of the business, where it's profitable now under the current owners, selling to the next generation at least at full market value with conventional financing, just may not work. And we may need to think about what do we change in the business plan or the terms of the transfer to make that financial viability work. There's also often a change in the labor distribution. So I've worked with a number of farm families where we have a couple that's done everything together. They've taken the wages that they've taken for themselves. It's been adequate for them. But now one person is going to take over in the family, and they have to replace the labor of two owners, which usually means hiring three people to take the place of the two owners, because the two owners put in more hours. And so how does that change the budget for the business? And the debt level often plays a huge role. Almost all farms I work with carry some level of debt. The question is a manageable level of debt? Because if the debt is so high at the end of, or when somebody's trying to exit, it means that not only is it maybe going to be challenging in how we could structure this to make it affordable to the next generation, because they have to assume that current debt, but also what's going to be left for the older generation for retirement. So funding retirement and healthcare is something we spend a bunch of time on. And as I said earlier, I like to spend the time on it, even if people tell me they're never going to retire and they're going to die on the tractor, because it's not always the way it actually goes down in the end as people age and find different health issues that come up. One of the biggest challenges in the retirement planning is actually around housing and where multiple generations may live. Is the older generation going to stay in the current house? Or are they going to retire to a different house? Does the farm already own a house that they can retire to? Or are they going to have to purchase another house or build another house, both of which are really financially daunting? And then trying to figure out how to get the younger generation to start to build some equity. And this is where, again, having a 5 to 10 year time frame can be helpful, where they can start to build equity so they don't necessarily have to buy things out all at once. And what does that structure look like? I've also talked already about fair treatment of off-farm heirs is often something we spend a lot of discussion on. Taxes, there's going to be taxes in these transfers, capital gains taxes, primarily what comes up, if you're going to sell assets. And so, we often need to figure out, well, how are the taxes going to be addressed in this? Though it's not as significant as a lot of people often will worry about, particularly when there's the changes in the federal estate taxes make that most hardly any farms in the country would fall under federal estate taxes. But Massachusetts, on the other hand, has a very low limit on asset value before you get to estate taxes. One thing I tell people, and this goes back to eating the elephant, is it's important to not let one issue dominate and prevent you from planning and taking actions, because that's what I see is when people get stuck on one area that is challenging. Sometimes people will want to just fix that one problem and everything will grind to a halt. Instead of looking, well, there's certain other aspects that we can be working on in parallel. As I said earlier, it's not a flow chart. Um, and so, maybe we make some progress on some other things while we're trying to work through whatever the thing is most difficult. I worked with one farmer who was just very, very obsessed about the tax aspect. He really didn't want to pay any taxes, and he was creating a scenario where, like, what if we do it this way and we do it this way? And I was like, this is going to make it so much harder, especially for the younger generation. Can you just accept that you're going to pay some taxes? We're going to minimize it, we're going to mitigate it, but you're going to have to pay something. It's not going to all go away. And that there are other goals that you want to meet that are going to be impeded if we just focus on the taxes. Do we have any questions at this point?
I'm going to make a comment because it's so important. I want to reiterate everything I have ever seen in Maine as well. It's never as big of a tax burden as people expecting it to be. I haven't witnessed it once. So when Mike says it's often not, but it takes up so much time in the conversation. So I just want to reiterate that and open the space. If anyone has questions, feel free to unmute or raise your hand and or ask it in the chat.
And also take a big stretch. We're an hour into this, so now we're staring at a screen. So take big stretches. Stand up if you need to. All right. Do we not have any questions?
Well, we could open it up just to, is if anyone else has a burning obstacle that maybe that Mike they feel has missed because he's seen it all. Just
Well,
okay.
we are going to
Well,
go on. I'm going to talk through some of these obstacles in a little bit more detail, but
okay,
yeah.
Molly has a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, gotcha.
Great. We just set up an owl, so I just want to make sure it was working. We have
Okay.
a question from one of the farmers here. If they don't have any family, that they're interested to take over the farm or they're interested in passing it along to, but they do want to start sort of planning for the next steps and what that may look like to, settle on what the future of the farm looks like. Is there are a lot of these resources that you're listing, would those still be good options for them to sort of explore what's a possibility? Or would that be look like something different?
Yeah. So this is the group up in Grand Isle County
Yes.
we're hearing from. Great. Yeah, we have a group of farmers that all went to their conservation district office today to watch it as a group, which is great. Yeah, particularly our guide on the successful farm transfer planning for farmers without identified successors. And then it's really common for people to come to us for just an initial one-on-one consultation, and we'll talk about specific things they can do. And for some people, it makes sense to sign up for some longer term support. Um, so we've worked with a number of farms that are trying to pass along the existing business. And so we are, working with them on trying to figure out what the existing business is, what the financials of the business is, its viability going forward, and then how to prepare, how to figure out what you're going to price things at, if you're going to sell things, what kind of time frame you want to do things in. Do you want to do a gradual transfer? And then how do you start recruiting? How do you start recruiting people, which I'm going to talk a little bit more detail later. But like I just a couple of days ago, I was working with a vegetable farmer here in Vermont, has a very successful business, no children that want to take over the business, had actually explored with a couple of employees about whether they want to take over. And neither one of them wanted to step forward. There's one younger one that he still has maybe some hope for. And so what we're doing is we're preparing a posting for that property. It's going to be posted on one of the tools I'm going to mention in a little while, where they're going to uh, advertise for another farmer who wants to come in this case, and partner with them and do a gradual transfer. Another farm I'm working with now, that I'm trying to actually get another meeting on the calendar with, they actually had a daughter who was involved in the farm, and then she and her husband decided to go off, that they needed a different kind of land base than what their parents were operating on, with more acreage, and they moved on to a different farm. And so we started recruiting another farmers to come in. And originally the idea was that they were going to take over the existing business, but now this couple that has come forward that we're in discussions with are they have an existing business that's different than the current farm business, and they're going to bring that there and share land together. As the older generation starts to phase out their business, it's going to allow for more land for this other farmer to grow their business. Though these younger farmers are looking at taking certain aspects over of the existing farm, particularly some of the greenhouse part of the business. Um, and so it'll be kind of a hybrid. And so there's a lot of different ways this can go depending on the goals of the exiting farmer, the assets that you have to work with, the business that you have, and who we're able to recruit. Does that answer the question?
And we shared the resource directly in the chat as well.
Right, right. Yeah, if you get
Yes.
all three of those shared directly, it'd be great.
Yeah, we may have some follow-up questions, but good answer
Yeah.
so far. So we can circle back.
Okay.
Thank
Yep.
you.
As I already, I wanted to just focus a little bit on a couple of, well, one of the most critical pieces that comes in when we're talking about transferring a business. And this is where either, here in Vermont, the Farm Viability Program can help people on the farm business planning aspect of it. In the other 6 New England states, we work with Extension and the Mass Farm Viability and different other organizations like the Carrot Project in Southern New England to get people business planning assistance. And the most common thing is that the current business is not profitable, or it's not big enough for multiple generations if the older generation doesn't ever expect to retire, isn't ready to retire, but they want to bring in the younger generation and compensate them well. It's trying to figure out how to necessarily not grow the business physically, but grow it in terms of profitability. Now, sometimes that is physically, sometimes it's about improving efficiencies, about adding additional enterprises and so forth. I've already mentioned about how too much debt can be a factor. And then one of the things that really comes into play is that many farmers, either because they don't have the capacity to keep up the infrastructure, or maybe they get to a point where it's just like, I just don't feel like investing in new projects because I want to kind of take things easier. There's a lot of times where the infrastructure is not sufficient for the next generation, and there are huge capital needs. I'm working with a conventional dairy right now that had an old tie stall barn. Disrepair, needs a lot of work, very inefficient. But the parents were able to make things work with that tie stall barn. The next generation's looking and saying, this barn in this condition, we can't keep doing what we're doing if we're going to take over. But the cost of building a barn, of course, is very expensive, and so we're trying to figure out what we can do to renovate the barn in a way that's going to make it more feasible for the next generation. Different regulations can come in. In Vermont, we had the required agricultural practices for water quality. And then if you're a vegetable farmer, you might need to be under FSMA or GAPS. And so you need new wash pack facilities for um, for your vegetable operation to be able to comply with food safety regulations. And so that deferred investment, or just the fact that things are changing in the agricultural world, so that there's going to be different needs for that next generation, um, drives a conversation of how can we fund that, especially if the farmers need to do a buyout of the older generation, because we don't want them buried in debt. And so we spend a lot of time trying to work through those things. Of course, we try to take advantage of as many grants as possible when that's feasible, including water quality grants here in Vermont, and NRCS grants and so forth, and working lands grants, and trying to figure out other sources other than borrowing money. But we also particularly see when a farmer doesn't have identified successor, this often can get worse, because they're like, why am I reinvesting in the business that I don't know if anybody's going to take over? And there's been studies that have been done on this that show that that is definitely the case. And I'm fortunate to work with a few farmers that says, I got a good business here and I want to keep it up so that it is going to be worth something to someone else. And that includes the vegetable farm I just mentioned a little while ago that we're about to advertise. And but there's other cases where that's not been the case. Or it changes once the successor's been identified. I worked with one orchard here in southern Vermont where there was just thousands of feet of old deer fence that would frost heaved up, posts were starting to rot out, and wires starting to rust out. And when it was very clear that his oldest daughter was going to be coming back to the farm and taking over the business, he started reinvesting in all that deer fence. Because he hadn't been investing in it before, because it's like, I don't know what, if this is going to be a value to, value going forward. I don't know if it's going to be a value to me, because I don't know how long I'm going to be here. And it just completely changed the mindset, and they started replanting things and tearing up parts of the orchard and planting other crops that they were finding more profitable. And it was just there was a bit of a mindset change once he knew that there was going to be a successor there, that he was invested in. Doesn't have to be that way, but it often is the case.
Mike, we do have a question
And
about
then,
specifying a little bit more about no equity, no cash before you move on.
yeah, yeah. So then I wanted to make sure I mentioned, next week, again, we're going to talk about retirement. For about half an hour, and I want to encourage both the younger generation and the older generation to be here, because what I've seen time and time again is that the farmers who have saved money outside of the farm and not just put all their money into the farm have created scenarios where the farm transfer scenarios that we're working through are much easier, because it doesn't rely as heavily on the sale of farm assets for them to be able to retire. And it gives them flexibility in the time frame. It gives them flexibility in the amount of money that they need to achieve in the sale. So maybe they're not selling it at full fair market value. And those that often haven't addressed this early in life, throughout their life, are having difficulty because they don't have any money to support and meager Social Security to be able to retire on. And so limits their ability to be flexible in how they do the transfer. And that, and they maybe have some health issues. They're forcing them to retire when they didn't think they were going to. And I always tell people, it's like, if you don't think you're going to retire, if you put this money aside, you're still going to be able to access this money later. Maybe you put it back in the farm later if you're still working in the business. But if you don't put that money aside in your youth and through your middle age, then you're not going to have it. And a lot of people don't adequately report income and pay self-employment taxes to get as much Social Security as they would otherwise be eligible for. And then this last one that we apparently have a question on, the younger generation is often walking in, they don't have any equity to begin with, and then they have no cash to be put into the business. And so and this often includes sometimes the employee who's worked on the farm and who's been working for relatively meager wages, and so they haven't been able to save. They've been building great skills, but they don't have the money. And so whether it's family or non-family, it's the same. It can be the same issue. And so if the older generation needs to be bought out, then or wants to be bought out, then trying to figure out how to get them equity and how to build up some finances so that they can make a purchase, or that we take a different approach that doesn't require cash down for the purchase, becomes really important and can take a lot of time to work through. So what was the question that we had?
It was exactly that, Mike, just that when you touched
Okay.
on it, just to clarify, that you're talking about the younger generation
Right.
not having the cash
Yeah.
or equity that they've saved previously.
Yeah. So, and that's where to a gradual transfer and not, if you've got the farmer that says, I'm done and I'm going to put everything up, for sale, and we see people and they'll put up for sale the entire property with all livestock and equipment and supplies, and it's just not a number that the skilled people, usually who've been either working in that business or farming, working for another farmer, the idea that someday they'd have their own farm, can do all at once. Or family members are working in the business. They can't buy it out all at once if that was the expectation. But if we can work on building up equity over time, including using, sweat equity approaches where equity is part of the compensation, then that often gives them a foothold in there that makes them more bankable later. Was there any follow-up to that question? The person who asked it. And then this is a point I kind of already made, but I'll just make again, is that, there's often a new business plan is needed for the next generation. And sometimes it's an entirely new business. The type of farming that they're doing there is either not working financially or and maybe they can't figure out a way to make it work financially. Or the next generation just has different interests and sees different opportunities for the farm. And that's something that we spend a lot of time working through, and a lot of times the older generation is both saddened by it, but sometimes they're really kind of excited as well to see that there's the next generation is taking initiative and has some great ideas, and can be fully supportive of it. And it really depends on the situation, but there's definitely a need for them to often they want to see that this is not just pie in the sky or just some new trend, but that there's actually a good business opportunity there that really will make it feasible for the farm to continue to the next generation. As I've mentioned a few times, often we do this in stages. The first stage I haven't really talked about that I think is really, really important is to think about the transfer of management responsibilities. We often overlook that. A lot of times in transfer and succession, people get focused in on the transfer of assets, whether it's real estate or it's the livestock and equipment, the chattel. And really, if you're talking about transferring a business, you really want to make sure that next generation, first and foremost, has the skills, has an opportunity to demonstrate those skills through having adequate responsibilities. And then as they grow into that, the next step, if we're talking about, again, transferring existing farming businesses, that they start to have decision-making power, including how money is spent. If they're don't have any control over money spent, then they're not really going to be a true owner. And then there's the transfer of the intermediate assets. So anything of the non-real estate that's not real estate. In some of these cases, it may be that it's all being sold at once, and in some cases, they're becoming a partner. and it's just the business just involves the intermediate assets, and they rent the real estate. And then we work on trying to figure out the transfer of the real estate. Um, Sometimes we might do that at the same time, but often it's kind of on the back burner until we figure out these first parts before we start worrying exactly about how that'll be transferred. Each situation is different. And just to emphasize with the next generation needing to develop skills, the thing that I see the most often is that the younger generation, whether they're an employee on a farm, whether they grew up on the farm or they're an employee on the farm, or they've been working for other farmers and now they're looking to move into running a business, they may have all the production skills that they need. They may really be even better at sometimes than the older generation at it, but very often they haven't developed the financial management skills. And we're talking about running a business here. So those are critical for them to develop them. They maybe have never seen the books. I work with farmers in their 50s that have never seen the books. And don't know how to manage cash flow, particularly when you have, say, spring cash flow challenges because you've got a lot of employees coming into the vegetable farm, or you've got all your hay equipment, or you're planting your corn seed and your fertilizer, and but you haven't got the income yet to cover that. So trying to figure out how to manage that cash flow. What happens when you're running into difficult financial times? How are you prioritizing paying bills? Just even the bill paying or the how do you handle payroll? They maybe have never handled payroll. And then they may not have the business management skills in general of understanding permits and regulations and organic certification, if that's relevant. All of the business record keeping. They may not have, they may not even know all of the how you track crop records or fertility records or any of that business side of it because they're just involved in the production side. And so it's really important to get those skills to this next generation and spend time first making sure that they're going to be capable business people before doing worrying about transferring physical assets. And of course, some of it can be done in parallel. And then very much farms that are doing direct marketing. I've seen time again where the younger generations, they've just been in the fields and they're not going to meetings with wholesale buyers of produce or the farmers market meetings that maybe they've sold at farmers market, maybe they haven't. They're not used to the e-commerce, though it's often the younger generation that's been involved with the e-commerce more, but not always. And understanding how your e-commerce system works, how and how you actually use that not just for sales, but for marketing and promotion. And if this business is going to rely on continuing to manage the current markets and building new markets and figuring out where you can push prices, which has become a big issue in the last 3-4 years, is if we're not making money so much anymore because all our costs are going up but our prices haven't, how do you figure out where to move prices? How much can you move without hurting your market? That's been a challenge for everybody in the last few years. And how do you identify new markets when maybe the current markets aren't no longer paying what you need them to pay for this business to continue? So here's a typical, this is more oriented towards a family-based scenario, but younger generation goes out and gets an education. Now, it may or may not be in agriculture. It's just often good for these young people just to get away for a while and explore their options so they don't feel later like they just weren't ever given an opportunity to do something besides the farm. And I know 2 very successful farms here in Vermont where the the younger generation went off and became engineers and worked as engineers for like a decade, and then said, I want to be back here on the farm. And they actually brought a lot of great engineering skills to the farm itself. And I tell people that I often ask people when they say, "Oh, we don't know if our kids are interested." I said, "Well, how old are they?" And they're like, 24, 26, 20. And I said, if you can wait, it's really kind of early to know for sure. Because I've seen a lot of young people in rural areas all across the country. They want to get out of their podunk town for a while. They want to go somewhere and do something else. Not all of them. I mean, I've definitely worked with farm kids who grew up and came right back to the farm, but a lot of them want to get out and explore the world, maybe explore different careers. But when they tend to get married in their 30s now, they tend to have kids in their 30s, and then they start thinking about, do I want to, is this what I still want to be doing, where I want to be doing it, where I want to raise my children? And at the very least, they may move back to their rural town. They may not come back to the farm, but sometimes it's both. Um, and even if they're going to come back much younger, it can be helpful if they get an education and then go work for another farmer. If they're not just working in a totally different career, so they can see how other farms are doing things. And sometimes that reemphasizes, like, oh yeah, I guess, my parents know what they're doing. And sometimes it gives them some new ideas to bring back. Um, and when they come back, it usually makes sense for them to be an employee for a defined period before you even start thinking about them becoming a partner and an owner. Just make sure it sticks, that that they're really committed to this. And particularly if they haven't found a spouse right away, that could be something that maybe becomes an overriding factor and could, limit their commitment to staying with the farm until that's kind of settled. And and then over time, as I talked about, you want them to build those skills and responsibilities, and they may be asked in charge of some aspect of the business, be the crops manager, the greenhouse manager, the herdsman or woman, you may be looking at diversifying the farm and developing a new enterprise, and that becomes their thing to be in charge of, so that they have some ownership, if not in a tangible physical sense or economic sense, but just in terms of the management aspect of it. And then, as I've been saying, we often look at transferring the intermediate assets either through a full buyout or a gradual transfer, which is usually an LLC, usually filing taxes as a partnership, and then they lease the real estate. And there's a lot of different variations to this. I've kind of talked about a few of them. Um, and sometimes instead of a full buyout, you're going to become partners for a while. That's really a common scenario for us to do. And that maybe not just for the building up equity, but just because the older generation also wants to still be involved. There may be multiple partners involved because there's either multiple family members or family members and non-family members. It's not unheard of by any stretch that the next generation may be partnering not just with family, but with people outside the family. Worked with a number of farms where that's the case. But in other cases where the business is not going to continue, they may be able to utilize the land and build up their new business while still working on the other farm until that other farm is retired. And then, in some cases, there's just a clear break. The older generation is selling their farm business and turning over the land to a new farmer, whether it's family, employee, or somebody that they found through advertising for for a non family successor who's going to rent the land or eventually buy the land to bring on a new business. And there's a whole other host of variations that people will work through. And we've started to talk some about farmers without successors. We've had success with people recruiting successors. I've just described one scenario where the successor is not going to take over the new business. But other examples have been employees that we've brought on. There's a vegetable farm that I've used quite a bit on the panel. I don't know if we'll have them back here this year, but Crossroad Farm in Thetford, Vermont, and that was the one I described with 14 years of work where Phil, who now owns the farm, he was an employee from the time he was a teenager at 15 until he was 25 and got a poli-sci degree along the way, but kept working during college and had no real thought about taking over the farm business. But they just identified him as someone who was, since they knew that neither of their children were interested in coming back to the farm, they identified him and two other people as being potential successors. And we sat down and interviewed all three of them, one of whom wanted to just remain employee, was happy being an employee, wanted to collect a paycheck, didn't want the extra responsibility of being an owner. He knew what that involved. He's actually still there working for Phil. Another one wanted to go off and start their own farm at some point. So really wanted to create something new. But Phil was the one who stepped up. But it took a while, for Phil to be fully confident that that's what he wanted to do. And for him, part of it was that he had a girlfriend who was out in graduate school out in Colorado, and he wanted to see where that was going to go, whether he was going to stay in Vermont or go to Colorado. And when that got settled, that kind of helped the discussion move forward. And then, they got to a point where they ended up creating a partnership. And then they were partners for a significant amount of years before Phil bought them out. And then another vegetable farm that I've worked with, they had a long time employee, and so we had discussions over the course of about a year and a half with this long-term employee about him leaving. He worked part-time on this farm and part-time in a construction business, and about him leaving the business and that construction business, and then buying out the senior farmer from this vegetable farm business. And that's what happened 2024. He ended up buying out the existing or the previous owner completely. And the previous owner still lives next door and actually now is an employee and still works on the farm. But the business itself is owned by this former employee. And there are, a whole bunch of other examples out there where employees have stepped up. It could be that a scenario like I'm describing about where you're incorporating them into your new business, or it could be that you're inviting them there to lease the farm and start a new business on there. The Vermont Land Trust Farmland Access Program will work with farmers who are either have land that's already conserved or is potentially going to be conserved with recruiting potential successors. And then we also in Vermont, Maine, and Connecticut have land linking programs, which provide opportunity for you to advertise for free your farming opportunity, whether it's going to be a gradual transfer in a partnership, or you're going to lease the farm, or you're looking to sell the farm. All those are available through through these land linking programs. And then our organization, Land for Good, has a New England Farm Finder, which is New England wide, and actually the Vermont Land Link program will automatically, if you sign up for Vermont Land Link, it will automatically send your posting to New England Farm Finder so that you can be seen more region wide. And we definitely are trying to help farmers in southern New England find successors, but we do have a fair number of young farmers who are also looking to move to northern New England, whether it's Maine or Vermont. It's harder for some reason to get people to consider New Hampshire. And so people are moving around the region. I had worked with a great young farmer who was leasing land in Rutland County for a couple of years. And then through Farm Finder, he found an opportunity for himself in Maine. And so he just moved, and he's last I heard, he's been very happy with the rental situation, long-term rental situation that he has in Maine. So there's opportunities to, if you use the Farm Finder, to attract people who aren't necessarily in your state now. Word of mouth is often another way that people will get the word, will help recruit people. Or one vegetable farm that I worked with uh, looked at a young grower he knew through farmers markets, and this farmer was on 8 acres of leased land, and he was saw how attentive this person was to his crops, the quality of the crops that he produced, the quality of their presentation at farmers market. And when he realized that he needed someone besides his son to come into the business because the farm had grown quite substantially, and his son didn't want to run it solely by himself. Um, the senior farmer in this case went to this younger farmer who had his own business and said, "Would you want to come work for me and become a partner with me?" And that's ultimately what happened. And so, there's a few other cases out there where that's exactly what happened. Somebody went out and knew another grower in their town or their community, and went and actually recruited them and said, "I'd like you to come work for me and take advantage of the opportunity that I could present to you." And let's see, I just have a couple more. Do we have any more questions before I finish the last couple slides?
No, not right now.
So the real estate transfer, as I said a few times, typically is the last thing to transfer. Not always. For many family situations in particular, it's often transferred through the estate plan. In the interim, it's important if the next generation has got their business on the farm for them to have a written lease, and that lease should be bearing on heirs, successors, agents, and assigns, so that if for some reason there was a change in the estate plan, the lease would continue to allow them to continue to farm on that land. It's kind of like a stopgap in case anything happens to change in the estate plan, which unfortunately has happened occasionally. Sometimes the real estate is transferred sooner and before death. Sometimes it's people will transfer through gifts. We'll talk about some of the tax implications of gifts versus sales versus inheritance next week. And sometimes the gifting is just a partial gift towards bringing the cost down to something that's affordable. And sometimes we're doing these transfers as a gradual transfer of the real estate, just as we're doing the intermediate assets through a legal entity such as an LLC, where the younger generation is gaining equity over time. And particularly if there's multiple farm partners, that may be, there may be a need for an entity to own the land going forward, because you want to make sure that you're protecting everybody's interest in case somebody wants to leave. And then through just a direct sale, while the current farmer or the senior farmer is alive, and often it involves a conservation easement, not always. I've worked with families where we've even gotten as far as an appraisal on a conservation easement and looked at this scenario and said, well, it doesn't make sense at this time, particularly if there isn't a need for that initially, because they can do it financially without that. There was a farm family I worked with, a vegetable farm family in the Champlain Valley, and their daughter was taking over the business. Parents had saved adequately for retirement. The sale of the real estate wasn't going to happen immediately. They had already actually been talking to Vermont Land Trust and had the appraisal before I even became involved. And as we got talking through the process, it was very clear that the daughter shared the same ethics as they were. She was coming back to the farm to take over the business. She was working her way into the business. She wasn't going to cut it up for development. And because the parents had saved enough money outside of the farm to build their retirement home, there wasn't going to be a need for them to sell the farm to her immediately, and there wasn't going to be a need to sell the farm at the highest value. And so you only sell the development rights once in perpetuity, and that's a long time. And so sometimes it makes sense to only play that card when you absolutely needed to. And I've worked with plenty of scenarios where, for better or worse, that is the reason. Financially, they do need to sell the easement in order to make that happen so that you can provide for the older generation's retirement or if off-farm heirs. Though I warn people, you can only do that once in perpetuity. So now we have farms that were conserved 30 years ago, and they're going through a transfer now. Well, they can't sell development rights again to make up for a lack of retirement savings, for a lack of thinking about off-farm heirs, or for paying down debt. And so it's a useful tool. It's also just from a philosophical standpoint, if people want to make sure that they're protecting the land is protected, certainly all for it. But if people don't need to sell the development rights, I do encourage them to think about maybe that card can be played by the next generation or 2 generations or 3 generations from now. And if you have somebody, the thing that conserves the farm the most is having a successful, profitable farm business being run by farmers who have that ethic of keeping the farm a farm. And so if you have that, you don't necessarily need to have a third party involved. But it often is the case where it is necessary financially. In the transfer of the real estate, so we're going to talk about the differences in taxes between gifting or gifting partially versus inheriting real estate versus buying it. So all of that needs to be considered, including also the sale of a conservation easement is a taxable event for capital gains tax. So you need to consider, so even if that's the only thing that happens and then they're still going to lease the farm, there's still tax considerations there. Debt, equity, control, where are people going to live in retirement? As I said, that is one of the biggest challenges when we get to the real estate transfer or even just the interim period, is if there's not adequate housing for both generations. And then thinking about long-term healthcare, which we'll get into a little bit next week, and then in the third session, we're going to get into a lot more significantly with the attorney and trying to be conscious about how you transfer not just the real estate but any assets and its effect on long funding for long-term healthcare. And then my last slide, I'll just mention that particularly through the Farm Viability Program and often through some of the other programs we work, we'll come up with a written plan. Some can be more formal, or as we do with the Farm Viability Plan, the Farm Viability Plans, or it can just be some real clear sets of notes and agreements and people signing off. Yeah, this is what we're agreeing to, because it provides some level of accountability. I can't tell you how many times I come in and people have said we had this understanding, but we never put it on paper. And now we're kind of in a disagreement about what our original agreement was and the original timetable was, because there was never anything where it was put into documented to put it into some written form so that everybody could be clear on it. So however that is carried out, whether that's a plan or sometimes it's just through creating an LLC and moving resources in there with an operating agreement. But having some sort of written accountability is important. Another example of where this comes in is that you end up with, particularly has been common on dairy farms where they'll say, well, part of your compensation is calves, and then they raise the calves and they become their cows. But there's never a written record of that those are their cows. And the Farm Credit or FSA just has them on the balance sheet as the parents' cows. And so, it gets to be, there can be some challenges around that, not having it documented, so that's, abundantly clear. So with that, thank you, everybody.